This season for the Timberwolves is pretty much going the way that I think most of us thought it was going to go. The vibe coming into this season was very weird. Like the conversation was obviously they just made this really strange trade, giving up Karl Anthony Towns, and in return, essentially getting Julius Randle and Dante DiVincenzo. So theoretically, the idea is let's replace our number two option on the offensive end in Cat with Julius Randle, who is not as good of a player as Karl Anthony Towns. We were all very confused about that. And sure, there may be some things that Julius Randle does better than Karl Anthony Towns here and there, but largely, Cat is a better player than Julius Randle. So a lot of us were entering this season confused, right? And I don't think too many people were anticipating the Timberwolves and their performance this year. I don't think too many people were very excited about what they were going to end up doing. It was going to be something interesting to see for sure, but I don't think a lot of us came into this year thinking that they were going to be that much better than what they were last season. And I'm not saying they should not have traded Cat, right? Like at the end of the offseason for them last year, I was kind of on the train where I was like, hey, let's go out and explore potential trade packages for Karl Anthony Towns. What's out there? He had a lot of issues. There were some foul trouble issues. There were just some general consistency issues. So I wasn't anti-trading Karl Anthony Towns. But if you're going to move away a guy like Karl Anthony Towns, who is a legitimate all-star, you want to get the best return possible. And is Julius Randle and Dante DiVincenzo the best return possible? Absolutely not. And we're seeing it so far this season. They have been extremely inconsistent. They are without an identity, which is really weird because last season they had an identity. Their offense was never great, was never elite at any point in time last season, but they were hanging their hat on the defensive end. And there have been some flashes this season of them being this elite level defensive squad, but largely that has not been the case. They have been inconsistent and they're without an identity right now. I always say this, you can look all through my feed. If you want to contend, you have to have an identity. There has to be something you can hang your hat on. And right now, this team just doesn't seem like they have that. For one, a lot of people have tried to make this about Anthony Edwards. That was like a little bit of a talking point a couple of weeks ago, really started by some people online. And Charles Barkley didn't make it any better by egging this on. Blaming Anthony Edwards is ignorant. He's been amazing this season. His three-point shooting has been absolutely unreal. Knowing that he's shooting it this efficiently from three while taking a majority of his shots off the dribble, it's next level. Those are generally tougher shots that he's taking at a very, very high volume, right? It's not like he's just taking three-pointers a game. He's taking a high volume of threes off the dribble, and he's knocking them down. So trying to pin this on Anthony Edwards would be ridiculous, right? I think it's a lot of things going on here. For one, this franchise has not done a good enough job at building up a roster. Even when they got Rudy Gobert to pair along with Cat, that was a weird fit. That was a major experiment going with 2 7-footers in the lineup, quite like that, right? So you look at it, it limited Karl Anthony Towns. He was restricted primarily to just being a floor spacer. There may have been some times where if Gobert was off the court, he was doing a little bit more offensively, but the Timberwolves would close games with those two being on the court together. So that made for this really, really weird dynamic offensively where you didn't really optimize and get the best out of Karl Anthony Towns. Then we fast forward into this season and we're looking at things now. You're pairing Anthony Edwards alongside with Julius Randle. Just not a great fit. And I'm not downing Julius Randle at all. I think Julius Randle is a solid player who's put up some very solid numbers. He's been a part of some very good things throughout his career. So we talk about the revival of the New York Knicks as a legitimate playoff threat. He's a part of that, right? Like the first season where they got back into the playoff picture, he was a big reason, really the big reason behind it because he was an all-star that season, I think, what was it, back in 2021, right? So I'm not downing Julius Randle completely as a player. There have been some great things he's done, but you've always had these question marks about him for multiple reasons, intangibles, basketball fit, all of this stuff. Him and Anthony Edwards just did not make sense in theory to me, right? And we're seeing it right now. Again, none of those guys have been horrible, and they're not like a horrific duo next to each other, but it still isn't the best fit. So one thing that has to be looked at is, have the Timberwolves as a franchise done a good enough job at actually building up a championship level roster? That may seem a little bit too premature to talk about because they did just come off of a Western Conference Finals series. They almost got to the NBA Finals. They were, I think, 2 games or 1 game short of making the NBA Finals. But still, right? Has this team done a great enough job at actually building a team that truly fits and works together? Have they built a team that's going to create a system that's going to be sustainable to win championships? And the answer to that is no. Again, the Rudy Gobert and Karl-Anthony Towns thing was weird. It had its good moments here and there, but never truly came together, right? And this thing here obviously has not come together just yet. So I think the central thing to look at is, this squad just doesn't have a team that truly fits well together. They're not really optimized next to one another. Has this franchise done a good job at building up this team? My answer to that is no, right? I think that's something they've got to look at maybe at the deadline or the off season, and they still have time, right? Like, they're still really early in this thing where they're looking to be a contender out west. It is disappointing when you have a team that made the West Finals and they end up going on the decline since then, but they're still pretty early in this thing, so there's still a ton of time for them to figure this thing out. But right now, I think my biggest issue with the franchise is they haven't done a good enough job at really building up a roster that truly works around Anthony Edwards. And it's evident through their struggles on the offensive end, not just this season, but last season as well. Offense has always been something they generally struggled with over like the last few seasons. I think another thing too is internal development. So I'd say, for one, and this is kind of a really lesser talked about subject, Jaden McDaniels never took the leap that I thought he was going to end up making. When Karl-Anthony Towns was traded, I know they brought in Julius Randle, but in my head, I was thinking maybe this ends up being a season where Jaden McDaniels does more from a shot creation standpoint. It becomes more prominent for this team on the offensive end. They're going to be nice where Julius Randle is streaky, so maybe we see more from Jaden McDaniels stepping up. And just hasn't been that way. He's averaging around 10 points a game. Efficiency isn't amazing. Just never really made that massive leap. And I think that's one thing that has also hurt this team. There is a lack of consistent shot creation around Anthony Edwards. If you're watching that game, specifically a few nights ago against the Cavaliers, Cleveland deployed the zone. They've done it for a good amount of the last few games this season, where they're throwing these zone looks at different teams. When Anthony Edwards was out, there was no dribble penetration against that zone by the Timberwolves. None. There were some times here and there, but they got stumped up a lot of times because when that zone was thrown at them, they didn't have a lot of great dribble penetrators, right? When you're talking about trying to beat a zone, you need to identify and find the gaps. They don't have that. Now, Rob Dillingham could be someone who can fit within that role, and he's been much better with more minutes over the last few games. But largely, that's something that they're lacking: consistent shot creation and off the dribble stuff around Anthony Edwards. You would think Jaden McDaniels would be the guy to make that leap for this team and emerge as that guy, and it just hasn't happened. And I'm not asking Jaden McDaniels to be an all-star. I'm not asking him to be a superstar. I'm not even asking him to average 20. But 10 points a game for someone with that size and those physical tools, it's kind of unacceptable, right? It's not bad. It's not a horrible stat line, but I think from someone who has that level of upside, who's shown that promise, you would expect a bit more from him. So we can talk about the fit. That's one issue, but I think Jaden McDaniels not taking that massive leap is holding this team back a lot. Like, if you're looking at these games, Anthony Edwards is shot chucking a lot of times down the stretch, right? And he is kind of carrying the offense a bit down the stretch as far as a shot selection and things like that in these big clutch fourth quarter scenarios, right? And I feel like some of those duties could be sparsed out to not just Randle, but also Jaden McDaniels. I thought he would end up getting there a bit this season, and it just hasn't happened at all, right? He still kind of relegated himself a bit to this 3-and-D type of role, which he can do, but I think there's more to his game, and he hasn't truly unlocked it just yet. So that's one of my issues here with this Timberwolves team is it's not just a fit in the way this roster is built, but I don't think certain guys made that massive leap offensively just yet. The bright side is Ant's been amazing, right? Rob Dillingham has been great over these last few. He had like 15 in this game against the Grizzlies. So there are some bright spots here and there. But again, I think we all knew what it was coming into the season. It was a weird vibe. And as we're seeing right now, the vibes are still very weird. Inconsistencies. There are some lingering chemistry things happening here and there. We're hearing Anthony Edwards like critique this team in such an uncensored way in these post-game situations so frequently, right? Like it's a lot of stuff about effort, all of this stuff. You're seeing it happen way too much for a team that just got to the West Finals. And again, I'm not saying that this team had to come back and have this number one seed in the West sort of season. Is it ideal for them to have that type of season? For sure, right? But I don't think this thing is over with because in year two after making the West Finals, they're not as good as what they were last year. These things do take time. It is a natural thing to see a team kind of peak and decline for a little bit and maybe climb their way back up. So let's look at the Boston Celtics, right? There was a point where they made the finals in 2022 and then had like a disappointing 2023 playoff run where they lost to the Heat and they were right back up there and won a championship in 2024. We've seen that happen before. Right. So who knows what could happen here with this Timberwolves team. But the vibes have been weird. We all knew it was going to end up happening. And hopefully they can figure something out to turn it around and possibly get the best out of this particular roster and this particular situation that they have.